Thank you for joining us for today's program. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about the Contra Costa County Library and our resources and services. The Contra Costa County Library is happy to connect you with our resources, services, and materials at all 26 of our branches. Access more than 1 million physical items, including international language collections and thousands of digital materials 24/7 at ccclib.org. Visit any library to use our public computers, printers, and free Wi-Fi. You can also visit one of our branches with laptops for on-site use or check out a Wi-Fi hotspot for 3 weeks. Contra Costa County Library's adult literacy program trains and supports volunteer tutors to deliver basic literacy instruction to adults throughout the county. Visit our website and sign up for a digital library card today. Okay. All right, we're very happy to have Sarah Killingsworth here with us today. This program, Ethical Wildlife Photography, is part of our Outdoor Explorer program series that's running through this spring and summer. Sarah Killingsworth is a Bay Area naturalist, photographer, educator, and conservation advocate, and she's here to discuss her work, the importance of ethics in the field of nature photography, and coexisting with wildlife. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sarah. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Albert. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and to everyone who's listening in, thank you very much for participating in this program. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So I am passionate about both wildlife and photography. So ethical wildlife photography is an important topic for me, and there's so many things to discuss within it. I am going to allow plenty of time for questions, but I'm going to cover some of the key points. And I am a member of the NAMPA Ethics Committee, which is the North American Nature Photography Association, and participate in ethics discussions nationwide on photography. So as we get started, I have a few questions for you to think about as I'm talking and you're looking at the images that I'm sharing. The first question to think about is, what is your objective in wildlife photography? There are lots of things that you might be aiming for. Sometimes it's creating art. It could be communion with nature. It could be documenting a particular species or conservation storytelling. It could be raising awareness about a local issue. A second question to think about is, what impact do you have when you are out and taking photos? And a third question is, what impact do your photos have? So I encourage you to think about those questions while I'm talking today and when you're out in the field as well. As I mentioned, we'll take questions at the very end of this talk. So Albert's going to help me with that, and you can put them into the, I think the Q&A function is enabled for this. And the last final note before I get started, all of the wildlife photos in this presentation were taken by me. I use a very long lens, so even though many of the images appear close, I'm always a safe distance away from the wildlife in the photo. So as I move forward today, I'll be talking about best practices, but I have to acknowledge upfront that all of us are human. And even when we make our best efforts, at times we make mistakes, and we make mistakes in the field, myself included. And so with the best of intentions and being mindful of our impact, it is possible, despite our best efforts, to surprise or disturb an animal or another photographer. Knowing that, the best that we can all try and do is treat every living thing in the field, human and non-human, with respect and empathy. The welfare of the animals that you're photographing is more important than any image. This photograph is a blue-eyed coyote. Some of you may have heard or read about. There is a rare genetic mutation. Coyotes typically have beige, sandy brown eyes. There are a handful of coyotes, including some in Point Reyes National Seashore. Nat Geo did a piece on them called the Coyote, a 1 in a million, but they have beautiful light blue eyes. And the prior slide was a picture of a bobcat kitten. So what does ethical wildlife photography mean? First, it means do no harm. Your ethics come from a starting place of having empathy for the animals that you're photographing. It's also important to follow the rules of the location, to respect the land, and to respect private property. So some parks have specific rules about the distance you have to stay from certain species. For example, 100 yards from wolves in Yellowstone. And so if you're photographing in those places, it's important to honor those restrictions. It's important to respect the land and the ecosystem and not break branches or remove plants or other things to improve a photograph, but to leave the ecosystem as minimally impacted by your presence as possible. And lastly, of course, if something is on private property, you shouldn't go onto that person's property unless they've explicitly invited you to do so. This is a young coyote, a juvenile coyote at sunset. So an ethical approach recognizes that our mere presence is a disruption. The wildlife is aware of us and our presence, often long before we are even aware of the animal. So my goal in the field is to minimize that disruption and to communicate through my body language that I'm not a threat and that I can be ignored, just like a rock in the field. I never want the wildlife to be attracted towards me, nor to feel stress or pressure from me. I want to be completely forgettable. When I'm in an unfamiliar place, a guide, a naturalist, or a biologist, and these can be people that you hire privately, they can be through a parks program or a nonprofit, but someone who's familiar with the location and the species can provide valuable insight into that ecosystem and help you take better photos and observe even more interesting behavior than you might have known was happening. This is a very young bobcat kitten, stretching and wiggling a little bit in the sun. After spending thousands of hours in the field, I am confident that you achieve better images by being patient and sitting back. That's when wildlife tends to be the most relaxed and you have the best opportunity to observe natural behavior. Every now and then you walk onto a scene and something is unfolding very rapidly right as you get there. And you grab your camera and you put it up and you start taking pictures. It's the run and gun. And maybe you get a great shot from that. But the most memorable photos and the most memorable video clips that I've ever taken are of individual animals and species that I've spent many, many, many hours observing, learning about, anticipating, and being ready to photograph or film the behavior as it happens. This image was taken by a friend. He had a long lens, so the distance between the cat and me in this image looks compressed. I'm not as close as it appears, but I am obviously seated down and low and downhill from the cat. And we'll talk about positioning for photography, but this is a bobcat walking by and I was filming it. So I think it's a helpful exercise to put yourself in the place of the animal that you're photographing. Because for wildlife, every moment, every single moment is about survival. So the question you can ask yourself is, would you feel threatened if you were that animal? Because it could be trying to protect babies. It could be trying to catch a meal for itself or its offspring. It might be trying to find a mate. And if you stress an animal, it might abandon the hunt or abandon a food source, losing the meal, or it could use up valuable energy to flee. And any calories it burns, it's going to have to replace in order to survive. Some animals, like rabbits and deer, can actually die from stress. So it's really important to think about what's the impact on the animal you're photographing of your presence and your actions. As a whole, in wildlife photography, there's a question about what is our effect? As a wildlife photographer, how do we measure our effect? And that's not just our individual impact, but especially for popular destinations and charismatic species, it's the cumulative impact of many photographers. And then another question to think about is the images. Do the images that we create reinforce stereotypes about particular species or types of animals, for example, native predators or snakes, or do they show a different side of that species? To minimize wildlife stress, you can use body language to communicate that you aren't a threat. And when you think about the ways that a predator or a threat, a competitor, an aggressive animal might behave, it would often include prolonged direct eye contact, staring at the prey or the victim. It includes being higher up or above that prey and walking or running directly at it. And loud noises and large groups are, for the most part, almost always disturbing. The converse of each of those concepts is a communication then that you are not a threat. So if you're not looking directly at the animal while you're approaching, so I typically, after I've spotted an animal that I think I'd like to try and move a little bit closer to photograph, I will give it sort of a side glance. And then typically I will actually not only not look at it, but bow my head down slightly, almost in a submissive head gesture, and look away from it as I'm moving so that I'm not staring right at it as I come into proximity. Another option, another component of conveying that you're not threatening and you're not intending harm is to be at their level or below their level. So not being uphill. And sometimes for me, that means taking a really long walk around, because I never want to be uphill from an animal and coming down onto it. That is almost always frightening to any animal that's even a little bit skittish. So if it means going around and coming up a different way, even if it takes twice as long, the odds of the animal staying in place if you're coming from below are much higher. It also, you can convey that you're not a threat or a danger by making yourself small and staying still, by never running or rushing, by walking what I call a zigzag path. So indirectly, if you're a sailor, it's tacking, right? It's, if you want to go into the wind, you tack back and forth. So you pick your course and then you go at, a 45 or 90-degree angle against it, moving yourself closer. But you never want to get too close, and you never want to walk directly at a wild animal. Staying quiet is always a good idea. And something that isn't written on this slide, but I think is true, is that animals sense energy. They sense energy from people who come into their ecosystem, into their territories, and it's easy for them to sense agitation, even if it's not aggression, if it's a really intense energy, versus somebody who has a very calm, kind, and even energy. So keeping your own, even if you're super excited about the animal you're seeing, keeping your own energy really calm will help facilitate your ability to spend time with that animal. The total mass of people or objects that's observing an animal can also contribute to its stress. So it varies by species, and it certainly varies by individual animal. I always say that animals are similar to humans in that each individual has a temperament, and within a given species, some will be more or less skittish, some will be more or less tolerant of people in their visible area. So it does vary not only within, not only between species, but within species. In some cases, one or two people in a field photographing or observing an animal might not disrupt it at all, but maybe 3 or 5 people would. And every additional person in the field or additional car parked nearby on the road adds to that sense of pressure. If there are multiple people who all want to photograph the same animal, it's always best to try and stay together so that you're creating only one pressure point. And so the animal has lots of options of paths to go if it decides it wants to disengage or get further away from the people, rather than a group of people surrounding an animal on 2, 3, or all sides. And you don't ever want to place yourself between two animals, particularly never between a parent and a baby. This is a mother Thule elk and her calf. But you also, during the rutting season and in the winter here, the elephant seals, there are times of the year in certain species where the males are battling for dominance, for position, for territory, for females. And in that case, you never want to get close to the males because they're amped up and ready to confront somebody that they think is a threat. And speaking of young, there are really special considerations for nests and dens. If you're lucky enough to find a place where an animal has their babies, whether it's a nest site or a den, you should really try and keep your visits to that area brief to minimize the stress you might cause the parent and those young. Staying too long on a nest or a den site can prevent a parent from returning from a hunt or from returning with food for those babies. It may even cause them to move their young to a different den site, which may be less safe than the original. So parents often try and distract predators or threats away from the nest. So snowy plovers and killdeer and other birds will, the parents will act as if they have a damaged wing and drag it along the ground and try and lead a potential threat away from the nest, away from their babies. If a parent has left the nest or the den and is coming back with food and sees a person in what they think is close proximity to the babies, they sometimes will not bring the food to them because they don't want to give away the nest location. They don't know for sure whether the threat can assess accurately where the babies are hidden. And if they give it away, then they think they've endangered their kids. So they won't bring the food source back. The problem is that many young need to eat regularly. Others rely on their parents. In a nest situation, the parents helping to regulate their temperature, either keeping them cool, protecting them from sun under their feathers, or keeping them warm if it's a cooler climate. So you never want to interfere with a parent returning to a nest or a den site. And I would say if you're with a nest or a den and you're watching it, you don't want to stay more than 20 or 30 minutes. But certainly if you've been there that long and you haven't seen a parent, you should leave, because it could be that that parent is nearby and is choosing not to return out of a desire to protect the location. And when people do get too close, excuse me, my allergies have kicked up this week. I'm sorry. So people sometimes do get too close to dens. I was photographing and filming some very young coyote pups on a den, and was staying a reasonable distance away and downhill and further away even than the regulations in the particular park would have required. But out of my own concern for the young, stayed further back, along with several other photographers. And at some point, apparently after we left, another photographer decided to go all the way up the hill and walked into and around the den site, basically. And as a result, the next day, the mother moved all of those pups. So you never know whether the next den site they pick to try and protect the pups will be as safe as the first one. And you run the risk that those pups, in this case, it was a coyote, but that young are vulnerable to predators when they're being moved. The nest or den location is now potentially more visible because of multiple trips. Excuse me, in this case, the coyote had to come. She led little groups of the ones that could walk. And then the last one, the little runt of the litter, she had to go back and carry in her mouth to the new den site. So she made 3 or 4 trips in a relatively short period of time, moving all those pups, which gave predators in the area potentially a chance to observe her and where she was going with them. A cautionary note about social media. So social media can be a place that you can share concerns and environmental causes and coexistence tips. It has the potential to be useful in messaging about wildlife and coexistence. Social media also, however, has the ability to create tremendous pressure on particular locations and on particular species. And so for that reason, it's best, if you're sharing images of wildlife, it's best not to disclose those locations, and especially to never disclose locations of any dens or nests. So I never list locations in my photography. If you go to my Instagram posts, most of them don't have any location at all. I am here in the North Bay, but there's not a specific location ever given. And with respect to dens and nests, I typically, if I am fortunate enough to be able to photograph juveniles, so young, if it's bobcat kittens or coyote pups, I typically don't post those images for at least 3 months and sometimes 6 or 12, because I don't want to create a flurry of people coming and trying to look and find those same individuals and that same nest or den site. I want to protect the babies. So I don't post contemporaneously any images of young. Another way you can minimize your disturbance is to minimize the visual disturbance that you create. And that can be accomplished with blinds. So you can purchase pop-up blinds, and those are often used by bird photographers. Your car actually makes an excellent blind for photography when it's you're doing something where the photography is near the road. So Many animals who have roads that go through their territories are used to cars going by and even cars parking alongside the road. And staying in your car is actually far less threatening for those animals than getting out and walking in their area. And so in this image, there's a bean bag. So they make U-shaped bean bags that can sit on your car door over the window, and you can balance your lens on the top of it and then use it to take photos out of the window of your car. If you're going to do that, do make sure that you're parked someplace that it's okay to be parked, and to make sure you're fully off the road. It's also best to turn off your car engine to minimize the noise and reduce the disturbance from the engine sound. Knowing wildlife behavior can help with two different things. One is taking better photos, which most photographers want, because you can anticipate the optimal moments for a photo. It also, a second piece, is it allows you to understand signs of stress. So if you've done some research, if you have information about an animal's baseline behavior, you'll be able to tell when that animal changes the behavior. You'll know that when it does a certain thing with its eyes, or it turns its ears sideways, or it puffs its throat, that's a sign of stress, even if it hasn't run or flown away. You can also be alert for those signs once you know what they are. And if you see them, then that's your cue to start, initially at least, to back away, but potentially to leave the area altogether. And every species has a gradation of responses, of stress response. And so they will be alert and aware of you when you enter their space. But then how much it escalates from there depends on the level of threat that they perceive and how they feel. And so if you're able to recognize each cue of stress, then you know when you need to maybe stop approaching or back up or leave, depending on what you're observing, because animals will use the least amount of energy necessary to flee a threat, because again, they're preserving those calories that they'll have to replace with another meal. So an animal won't run unless that's the absolute thing it has to do, and it won't fly a long distance. An animal, even if it's stressed, will typically only go as far as it thinks it needs to be safe from a threat. But you don't want to make an animal run or fly away. You want to be alert to the signs before that you're causing it stress, so that you can adjust your presence and your conduct accordingly. It's a good idea to take time to sit and observe. You can read a lot about wildlife, but I have learned the most simply by sitting in the field. It's a chance to really understand what the behavior is when it happens, and to see it happen in different contexts with different individuals can be really helpful. So a few examples of how understanding behavior is helpful from a photography standpoint. Different species have a tell, if you will, before they're about to do something that might be interesting photographically. So coyotes, when they're hunting gophers, will they'll stand over a gopher hole, and they'll tilt their head side to side with their ears positioned to listen for the gopher. They then will do a leap and essentially nosedive into that gopher hole. But right before they leap, they do a slight rock backwards onto their hind legs, and then they leap. So if you're a photographer and you know that that's what they do, then you know the minute they start that little rock back, you should start pushing your shutter, because that split-second leap is coming almost instantly. And it's also a good time to make sure that your shutter speed is fast, that your depth of field is big enough to keep them in focus, even if they're moving. You know, they may not be. This shot, the coyote was essentially moving laterally, but sometimes they're leaping towards you, which is great. But then your depth of field, if you're shooting in a manual mode, would need to be adjusted to keep them fully in focus. Another behavioral cue is birds typically lighten the load, quote unquote, before they take off. So when a bird is sitting on a perch, if it poops, that is what I call the photographers on your mark, get set, because the next thing they're going to do is go and take off. And so again, you want your shutter speed, your depth of field ready to get that lift off, and it can be a great shot. But if you know what to look for, you know when that's about to happen, and you can be sure that you're ready and focused for that behavior. Another behavioral cue is with bobcats. Bobcats have several different modes of hunting, but one mode of hunting gophers involves creeping up very stealthily and low and sitting for 20 or 30 minutes, almost motionless with the occasional twitch, as they wait for the perfect moment to lunge forward and grab the gopher. Typically, right before they make that lunge, they fold their ears flat to their head, like not just turned back sideways, which is a bobcat's sign of annoyance. One or two ears flattened back, it means they're ticked off, sort of like a house cat does the same with their ears. But when they flatten the ears to the head, almost like a helmet, it usually means they're about to leap. Now, they don't always. Every now and then they decide that the gopher is not going to be high enough that they're going to grab it. But if they do flatten their ears, it's another chance to know that the leap and the coming up with the gopher in the mouth, that photo could be coming in just a minute. So people come to photography with so many different goals and different aims, but at the end of the day, everyone wants to get the shot. And what we have to consider is, at what cost is that shot? What will our actions do? Will we stress or harm an animal? And I have to stress that using a long lens is really key. iPhones can be zoomed in for photos, but they're generally not a good way to take portrait photos. And getting so close that your iPhone could take a portrait photo is definitely not easy and not a good idea in almost every situation. There are very few animals that you can take a good close portrait of with your phone that are not captive animals. And we'll talk about captive animals in a minute. However, there is a huge market of used camera gear, and with all of the mirrorless cameras and their lenses specifically for those bodies, there's a lot more used DSLR cameras and lenses available at much lower prices. And there are also lens rentals. So if you don't need a long lens all the time, but you have a particular location or a trip, and you'd like to have a longer lens for that, you can rent the lens and have it temporarily. So I've mentioned it before, but you should never directly approach a wild animal, and you should never indirectly approach one unless you have some understanding of that species and their behavior, because they could be defending food sources or young. You don't know, if you don't know what their season is for rutting or sparring between males. And some species, like elk and moose, might look relatively harmless and not seem dangerous, but in fact are actually quite dangerous. So moose are some of the more dangerous animals I've ever photographed, probably. And so if you don't know that and you were to approach a moose, and there's lots of videos online, and you can see it on Instagram or YouTube of people getting too close to elk, for example, and getting either butted or actually tossed. There have been people thrown by elk getting too close to them for photos. So just because an animal isn't a predator, isn't a carnivore, doesn't mean that they're safe to approach. I also want to talk a little bit about photography etiquette, because for me, showing respect and empathy is respect and empathy not only for wildlife, but also for other people in the field, as well as the animals. So for me, that means I don't join any photographer in the field unless they have specifically invited me. And when I say any photographer, I mean any, including my two closest friends who are photographers. If I see them out shooting something, I don't join them unless they give me the wave in, because I don't want to interrupt what could be a great photo session for them. So when you see a photographer photographing an animal, they may have spent hours, days, or weeks observing and getting into a position for that photo when you've now come along. And if you rush in, you run the risk of depriving them of the photo that they otherwise could have had, of behavior that might have happened had the animal's stress not been increased by your presence. So if you come into that field, your presence, your movement, all of that, again, shifts the dynamic in that environment and is an additional cause of stress. Even if the animal doesn't run away, and it might run away, or in this case, this is a badger photo, the badger would just dive in its hole. Even if that doesn't happen, it may not continue to hunt the way it was. It may have been in the middle of a grooming session and stop. And And I always remind people, you don't know what's happening that you can't see. So there could be an additional animal that you're not aware of that's in the brush nearby or in a tree nearby. There could be an interaction either within that species or between two species, and you may only be seeing part of the story when you happen to see the photographer and the one animal you might see them with. So out of respect, I would suggest that you not join any photographer in the field unless you've been invited in, and think of it a little bit like going into that field is like cutting in line at the bank or the grocery store. We all would like to get to the front of the line and complete our transaction and leave. But if we get to a cashier and there's a line in front of us, we allow those people to do what they've come to do first because they got there ahead of us. And with photography, nobody should sit on a particular animal or a particular location for hours and hours and hours on end. So hopefully that photographer will do their, session with that animal or those animals, and then they'll leave. And if you decide you want to come back later and try and photograph that same animal, you could do that. The goal being to not put too much stress on the animal, even cumulatively, but certainly not create large groups around it. And by joining someone in the field, you may cause them to sacrifice a shot based on your desire to take a photo, and you may or may not even be able to take a photo. Sometimes that animal might just turn and run, and then you not only don't get your photo, but now the person who had been photographing them is done with their photo session as well. I often say that time is wildlife photography's greatest gift, but also its greatest challenge. So for me, the time I spend in wild places with wild animals, that communion with nature, those moments of just pure quiet and being fully present are a priceless gift. And I'm grateful for every minute that I spend in the field. But it is also true that it takes an enormous investment of time to get photos that are really remarkable, that show incredibly interesting behavior, that have an intimacy with an animal that is relaxed and comfortable. And we don't all have that much time to devote to it. And so it can be difficult if you have a short period of time to try and get photos that are a reflection of the animal's true nature, to get that natural behavior. Hiring guides, working with biologists and naturalists is a good way to try and increase your odds with a short time frame. But sometimes if you don't have a lot of time, it's not realistic to think you're going to be able to do something spectacular photo-wise by racing in and taking the photo. Every now and then that works out, but oftentimes that kind of rushed energy doesn't lead to great photos. Many of the unethical practices in wildlife photography are effectively shortcuts. They're things that people do to try and minimize the amount of time and effort to obtain a photo of a particular species or a particular behavior. So I got into wildlife photography based on a passion for wildlife. And when I first heard that people baited animals, baited owls and other animals by putting out either live or dead bait, I was shocked because I couldn't imagine why you would want to put dead bait out or even, live bait from a pet store, because it wasn't natural behavior. And why would you want a photograph of something that wasn't natural behavior? But it is quite common. This image is a great gray owl, which is an image that I took, and this owl was not baited. It was hunting naturally at sunset. But I did observe a guide who had frozen pet store mice, that he was on a different day with a different owl, throwing mice to an owl. And so people do that to try and get shots of the owl coming straight towards them. It's also common to bait bears and wolves, particularly in Europe and Canada. They set up blinds and then have feeding areas in front of it so people can photograph bears and wolves, which don't generally appear together. Another way that people sometimes try and take a shortcut is with what's an audio lure. So something that sounds like a distressed call of prey or of young. Sometimes people use a playback or an audio call for birds to bring them in. Sometimes there are visual lures. So something that looks like dead prey or an injured animal will be flopping on the ground to try and draw in a predator. And then there are practices of using dogs to chase and then tree mountain lions, also called pumas or cougars. Obviously, that's incredibly stressful to the cat being chased up the tree. Another thing that when I started out in photography, I had no idea existed was game farms. So game farms are private facilities that keep in captivity typically very desirable, exotic, usually predator species. Wolves is one example. And those animals are kept generally in small enclosures, chain link fences, concrete floors, and trotted out to a performance area that's a natural looking habitat to perform for photographers. And they're typically fed in that environment and often not fed before that, so that they're hungry and they perform, quote unquote, for the photos. It's a terrible quality of life for the animals. There are other captive animals that don't raise the same ethical issues. So there are true wildlife sanctuaries where animals have much, much larger spaces. There are animal rehabilitation centers that sometimes an animal will come in injured, and while it can be saved and it survives, it's not releasable back into the wild. Those animals end up as ambassador animals for wildlife and do, community presentations and school presentations. There are also zoos that are accredited, and photographing captive animals in that context is far different than at a game farm. But if you are photographing captive animals, it's important to include truth in your captioning, to say where you took the photo so that people don't mistake it for a wild animal. In this particular photo on this slide, this is a wolf in Yellowstone. It's a photo that I took. Yellowstone requires, as I mentioned, 100 yards from wolves. I was 100 yards from this wolf. I had a long lens that I was shooting with, and this photo is cropped. So it might look like I was close to this wolf, but I was 100 yards away. If you are selecting a wildlife tour or a photography workshop, it's important to ask questions about the wildlife interactions, especially if anything in the description says that the sightings are, quote, guaranteed. There are almost no guarantees in life, and certainly in wildlife photography, animals are unpredictable. It's part of the challenge. It's part of what makes it sometimes a bit like a treasure hunt with wildlife. But find out if they're going to be fed. There are workshops that throw fish to eagles, throw bait to owls. Some workshops go to game farms to photograph wildlife. So it's important to know what you're getting into if you sign up for any of those. This image is a coyote approaching a car in Yellowstone. In this particular instance, the person in the car was a photographer. I don't believe he had any intention of feeding this coyote, but this coyote had clearly been fed in the past, was habituated to the idea that humans in cars were a source of food. And as soon as the photographer opened his door, the coyote crossed the road and approached the car. Most wildlife conflict is the result of animals that have been habituated to humans and typically have been fed either directly or indirectly. Indirect feeding is things like leaving out unsecured trash or leaving your pet food out in a place where wildlife can access it. Another ethical issue is drones, which are often a source of stress for wildlife, especially if they're flown too close to an animal, near juveniles, or near a nest or den site. And so drone use has to be taken very, very carefully. It's also not allowed in national parks, so you have to understand the rules and regulations around drones if you're going to use them. Wildlife photography can bring joy, and it can also do good. So I do want to highlight that wildlife photos can be used to support and protect voiceless wildlife. You can bring attention to important environmental issues and endangered species. You can inspire people to take action. Anything from sharing facts and images in a blog or a Nextdoor post to working with local nonprofits and wildlife rehabilitation centers, using your images for education about our human impact and promoting coexistence. This is a bobcat leaping into coyote brush, and it was amazing to me to watch. The cat sat for about 20 minutes or 25 minutes listening and watching, and then it sprung, and when it came back out, it had a vole in its mouth. So it sprung face first into this bush and came out with dinner. The last couple of slides I have, and then we can get to questions. Some resources that I have either written or have read and think really highly of. A couple of things that I've written are listed at the top. They're all linked on the publications page of my website. Other resources, Melissa Grew has written more articles about this and given more interviews than I could possibly list on this page. But if you Google her, she is an immensely talented photographer with incredible ethics and a really wonderful, wise way about her advice. So I encourage you to look at her things. The NAMPA website, the North American Nature Photography Association website, does have an ethical field practices guide that touches on many of the things that I've talked about. And then because this is a library talk, I had to offer some suggested reading. So for the question of empathy and understanding how animals communicate and experience their environment, Beyond Words and What the Robin Knows are both fantastic books. For human and wildlife interactions, Our Wild Calling is great. The Thing with Feathers is a really interesting look at different types of intelligence and skills that as humans we don't have, but other species do. And then The Accidental Ecosystem is another human wildlife discussion, particularly around cities and how they form an ecosystem that wildlife has become adapted to and become able to thrive in. And then lastly, a fun book, if you haven't read it, Fuzz, When Nature Breaks the Law, is a really entertaining read about a variety of situations in which there is human-wildlife conflict and a discussion around ways that we can address some of that conflict. Not listed here, but another book I highly recommend is The Cougar Conundrum about mountain lions. So I'll add that to the list. And with that, I am now ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. And for our attendees, feel free to enter any questions you have in the Q&A function there at the bottom, and I will relay those to Sarah. We have two in there right now. The first one, this question is, isn't the location in the data of the digital photo an important redwoods location was revealed in the data attached to the photograph?
Okay. It can be. And so there's a couple ways to deal with that. So if you are importing digital images into Lightroom as a catalog, when you do your export, you can select a square that says remove location information. I do that for every export I do. If it's a photo from an iPhone, you can click on the info and swipe up to location, and you can click no location and remove the location from an iPhone photo as well. So for every single image that I post to social media, I have manually, specifically myself, removed the location.
Thank you.
Yep.
Second question we have is, someone says, totally understand not posting location for baby animals. For general wildlife photos, I never post geographic coordinates, but is the name of the park okay?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the species. So for example, things like tule elk or elephant seals that Point Reyes National Seashore is known for, posting that you're in Point Reyes is not such a big deal. The location is more sensitive if it's something like a badger, because certain species are more skittish or more desirable and may only be visible to a certain extent in certain months. And so if you're posting a photo contemporaneously, so I happen to know that photographers do this. If you went out to Point Reyes tomorrow and you found a parent and a young, I mean, even if it's not a parent and a young, let's say you found a badger and you post a picture that says Point Reyes National Seashore yesterday. I personally know at least 10, if not 20 photographers who, if they saw that post, would go out to Point Reyes as soon as they could and look in the places where they think a badger is likely to be. So the location and the contemporaneous posting is potentially what creates a problem. If you're not posting contemporaneously, like if you're posting weeks or months later, I think location and particularly the park name is far less of a big deal. And then it depends on the size of the park. You know, if you're in Yellowstone, it depends again on the species, but there may be many, many places where people would see a grizzly bear or a black bear or, you know, an elk. And so it's a little bit species specific and sort of rarity specific, but it also depends whether it's a current posting or if you're saving it and posting it a few weeks later.
Thank you. And I love the image of the bobcat there. Look for this question slide. That's great.
Thank you.
Okay, next is, do you have any tick prevention tips when you're sitting in a field?
Oh, I was just talking about ticks yesterday because I was photographing a bobcat that had a lot of them, and I was lying in the grass thinking, oh, but knock wood, I don't tend to get ticks as often. If I get anything, it tends to be fleas, unfortunately. But anyway, my usual approach is I always wear long pants and long sleeves. Even if it's relatively warm out, I'll wear like the sun shirts, the really lightweight clothes. But especially in the winter and early spring, I also wear knee-high rubber boots over my pants. And so that prevents any fleas or ticks from getting sort of around the ankle and going up in the pants that way. You can use insect repellent. I typically don't, but my best prevention is honestly to do a check when you get home and make sure, I shower every day, and I find that that does help sometimes if there's one that you have on you, but it usually takes a day or two before they really have latched in, that a shower can often help wash one off before it's attached.
Thank you. Okay, what is the longest that you've sat for?
Let's see. The wolf image that I shared in Yellowstone, I spent 8 hours in one location and no food, no water, no bathroom. And because it was a situation where there was a bison kill close to the road, but there was a ravine between the road and the carcass, and the rangers were there. They had measured with like one of those golf laser measuring devices where 100 yards was, and there was a line, and everybody had to be at that 100-yard mark from the wolf. They wouldn't let you step any which way. And so we were sometimes standing, sometimes sitting, but we were there for 8 hours straight.
Wow, thank you. Someone is asking if the lens camo wraps are effective.
So I use those on all my lenses. I use the lens coat ones, they're neoprene, and I do think that they help to minimize the sort of visual presence of a big lens, but I use them myself, not just for that, but to protect my lens. So I shoot Nikon, so the lenses are black. And so you run the risk that in very hot sun, your lens heats. But also, I'm often on the ground where there's dirt and dust, and there's often fog or moisture in the air. And so that neoprene cover just helps protect your lens a little bit from all those things. The only thing I will say with those lens covers, because I've used them in Alaska and British Columbia, and if you're someplace where it's raining all day and your gear is damp, sometimes you end up wanting to take those covers off because they end up holding moisture to the lens, and that's not good. So you sometimes want to roll them off or fold them so you can air them out a little bit underneath. But in general, I think they're good for protecting, and they do minimize the appearance of the camera.
Thank you. Okay, this question, a couple questions here. First one is, what lens do you use?
So I would say my go-to lens is a 600 millimeter f4, but I do sometimes shoot with a 400 2.8, and I actually really love the 70 to 200 if something is a little bit closer or if you want an environmental shot.
And the second part of this question, I am an insect photographer and am often faced with peers who freeze and kill their subjects before photographing them. They end up with a perfect shot, but at what cost? Is this something you address in your ethics discussion?
I haven't ever talked about insects, and frankly, I didn't realize people killed them to photograph them. I guess I have a hard time with that. I'm not sure how to address it other than to say it's certainly not something I would personally be comfortable doing.
Got it. Okay. Are there park regulations for photographers, and where are they usually posted or listed?
I don't think that there are regulations specific to photographers versus other recreational users. So hikers, birders, all of that. most parks have a park website, and on that website, there's usually some subsection about wildlife, a different tab or a different section. And within that, there are rules about distances. And so, Point Reyes National Seashore has rules about how close you can get to the elephant seals. And Yellowstone has rules for the wolves and bison. But I would say the park website is usually the best place. But if you're going to a park and you have a particular species in mind and you think there's a possibility there's going to be some requirement, you can always ask at the entry kiosk or find a ranger and just ask them if there are any limitations. But I'm not aware of them being specific to photographers in any park.
Thank you. Question. I am curious what your thoughts are on the use of drones in wildlife photography. Do you or any of your peers use them in any context? Do you have any noteworthy good or bad stories of their use in wildlife photography?
Yeah, I don't use them. I would say that my close friends don't use them generally. I think from my own perspective, the most useful thing in conservation storytelling relating to wildlife that a drone could be used for is sort of the aerial shot of an animal's territory or habitat, or if you're talking about degradation of a particular area versus a nearby pristine forest or coastal chaparral or something. Those are shots you can get also from a low-flying plane as opposed to a drone. But I think when it comes to wildlife, that's probably my comfort limit, is something that's a pretty high up aerial shot. As far as good and bad use, in a very short Google search, you can find some drone footage of wildlife. There's a clip of a bear cub that gets startled by a drone and ends up like sliding down a hill. There's another one of a bobcat. I think it's bobcat kittens on a log, and you can see, if you look at their facial expressions, you can see that they're startled and stressed by the drone that's filming them in this video clip. So if you Googled, wildlife harassed by drone, I'm pretty sure you'd get a lot of hits.
Thank you. What is your most useful lens length?
Yeah. I would say my most used lens is my 600 f4, but that's because what I tend to shoot are intimate portraits of either individuals or particularly of parents and young and those behavioral interactions. And for those, I always want to be a reasonable distance away. And so for me, having a long lens is really important. That said, when I've traveled and spent more time photographing bears, grizzly bears in Alaska, spirit bears in the Great Bear Rainforest, a 70 to 200 is a really useful focal length. So it depends a little bit what you're shooting and how much of an environmental shot you want to get versus a portrait.
Thank you. We still have about half a dozen questions, so I'm going to try to get through these.
Okay,
Please
sure.
talk about the ethics of walking off of established paths and how to know when it is okay.
So I think it depends on the habitat. Most parks have pretty clear rules. Some parks say you have to stay on the trail. Others don't have any such admonitions on the park map or at trailheads. And then, I think, so in lots of places, including like Point Reyes, you can indeed walk off trail. That's not prohibited. But you need to be mindful of the plants that you're walking through. If I'm walking off trail, I often follow game trails. So I'm walking in what is effectively a path that's been created by the wildlife. So it's already flattened down and there's not plants that I'm stepping on or damaging because it's already been worn as a path. I think it's a situation that you just have to judge sort of one at a time. You never want to go off trail in a way that endangers yourself, right? And so some places have cliffs or unstable sands and other things that would never be a good idea to go out into, even if there's not a sign. And if you think that there's a sensitive species that's nesting, in Point Reyes, we have the western snowy plovers are a threatened species. They close the dunes where they're nesting during nesting season to prevent people from walking through the area. So I think it's most important to read up on the location you're going to and understand if there are threatened species or endangered species there, what their habitat is, when their breeding season is, and make sure that you don't do anything that impinges on any of those things.
Thank you. How long have you been photographing wildlife, and how did the challenges change over time?
Um, the first question, as a hobbyist photographer for most of my life, as a serious photographer and then subsequently a professional conservation storyteller, freelance photographer, I would say that that transition is about 6 years ago, 5 to 6 years ago. And the challenges over time, one of the things I like both about wildlife and about photography, because I'm an inherently curious person, is that there's always more to learn. And so there are always new techniques to learn. There are always new behaviors to observe, a greater depth of understanding. So for photography, for me, the challenge, in the early days of shifting from a hobby to a professional was about the technical aspects of the camera, and then really honing in on composition of the images of what I wanted to create. And then as you get more sort of advanced in that track, then you start doing much more sort of creative things like rimlit or backlit images and panning, where you slow your shutter speed down substantially and try and track a moving animal with the camera, and everything is blurred except hopefully the animal's face, and the eye is sharp, but it gives a sense of movement. And there's several other motion blur techniques. And so I think the challenge is whatever you make it. There are things that I still don't know how to do that I would love to do, like astrophotography and the Milky Way, and macro photography. Somebody mentioned insects earlier. I've done a little bit of macro work, but not a lot, and it's a whole other skill set. So I think, there's always a new challenge, but I enjoy the challenges.
Thank you. What shutter speed do you use for sudden leaps, or if you're expecting a sudden leap, I guess?
Yeah. So it depends on the light, but for something that's a mammal that's leaping, if it's daylight, I'm probably at 1/1600. Birds in flight, it's at least 1/2000, and even 1/3200 if there's enough light for it.
Thank you. How about just two more questions? Have
Sure.
you ever taken a photo of a snow leopard?
A snow leopard, no.
Um, how do you research the areas you choose to photograph in?
I would say that I do two things. One is I research online. So I'll read articles online about a destination and about a species. And then I do have a lot of friends who are photographers. I do a tiny bit of guiding myself. And so as a naturalist and somebody who's in that network, I know other people in other locations that I've met over the years photographing in different places. And so I can reach out to them and ask them for tips. And then, sometimes just looking at photographs from somebody who's in that area can be really helpful. So if there are some well-known photographers who have taken images in that location, looking at what they've captured can give you ideas about the behavior you might see or the species that you might want to target.
Thank you. I think we're going to go ahead and stop the questions there. Thank you very much, Sarah, for being here today. That was a wonderful program. And just a reminder, this is being recorded and will be posted to our library's YouTube channel. And at the end of this webinar, you will have a survey to answer. We do have some prizes to give away. So if you're interested in entering a drawing, please fill out the information. Again, thank you so much, Sarah, for being here. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.